What's up, guys? All things automotive, Andrew here for my very first vlog. Today I got a interesting subject slash question to talk about that packs a lot of controversy, actually, and that is, do V6 cars count as muscle cars? That's a very controversial subject, like I just had mentioned. I myself drive a V8 Mustang, that's what we're in right now. Just headed to get gas because this thing just sucks it down like that. Probably average around 13 and a half in the city, and it's only a 4.6 liter. Pretty sad when a 5.0 Coyote gets better gas mileage and better horsepower than this car. But anyways, back onto the subject of V6 cars. Well, V6s have come a long way. That is for sure. You don't see really a V6 muscle car today with less than about 300 horsepower. Funny enough, we're just passing one right now. It's a yellow Mustang V6. Like I said, they've come a long way. Now, you don't tend to see any really with less than 300 horsepower. I'm pretty sure all of them come stock with about 300 horsepower, and that's including the Camaro, the Challenger, the Charger, and the Mustang. And that's a pretty healthy amount of horsepower. That's about how much horsepower I have in my V8 Mustang. This is a 2007. And yeah, that's nothing really to sneeze at. They're no slouches, to say the least. But coming back to the idea of how they came a long way, when you take a look at the V6s from the early 2000s, you could see that they're complete slouches and they're totally anemic. Most of them would come with like 150 wheel horsepower, which is absolutely pathetic in my opinion, and to call that a muscle car, I would say that's a sin. But many will disagree. I mean, plenty of people enjoy those types of cars, and I don't blame them, but how could you call a car like that a muscle car? There's really no, it doesn't pack much muscle behind it. So that brings me to my point of, can we really call V6 cars muscle cars? Do they fit into the same category? Let's talk about the reason why people buy V6 cars. Well, most people would agree that it mainly has to do with budget. You know, that's usually the surrounding issue when you're talking about buying a V6 car, because nobody with a budget that can comfortably fit in the dealer invoice or MSRP for a V8 car would settle for a V6. Now, I'm not talking those people that have to stretch and take out a bunch of loans. I'm talking people that have a completely comfortable budget and say they're looking at the new Mustang or the new Camaro. You know, those types of people that have free-flowing cash flow, they're not going to settle for a V6. However, someone with a tighter budget, it's not really a compromise in my opinion, but some part of you does have to make the compromise and say, yes, it's not completely 100% the performance of a V8, but hey, you're still getting 300 horsepower and around 275 pound-feet of torque. So, like I said, that's not really a slouch at all. But to say compromise, you would also be correct that you are compromising, and you would not be correct as well, because generally the V6 muscle cars, they're in the mid to high 20 range. So, you know, someone that's got that type of cash, that's not anything, that's not a small amount of cash whatsoever. You know, that's pretty good, you know, bunch of money. You know, you're talking for, you know, an RS Camaro price, you could pretty much buy a 1SS V8, which is obviously the one without all the bells and whistles. You're talking cloth interior and whatnot, but you know, they make some pretty nice V6 cars today, like such as the, yeah, like I said, the RS Camaro, or you can get the V6 Premium Mustang, which is very nice. And Dodge makes a very nice V6 as well. I've been in the interior and driven a couple of those. The absolutely ginormous center mounted screen, the head unit is amazing. You can watch Netflix on the go, but now I'm getting off on a tangent of how nice you could get a V6. But going back to why people buy V6s, well, generally, budget is one. Budget and compromise is one reason. And another could be, well, a 400 plus horsepower V8 car, such as the new muscle cars today, they pack a lot of punch, and do you really want to daily drive that? Some people say no. The V6 is just tame enough that you have power when you need it, and you can cruise comfortably when you want to. They're not generally as loud as the V8s. Most guys that buy them put an insanely loud exhaust, get rid of the cats, get rid of the resonators, straight pipe the whole thing out, and it's loud. You know, it makes for an uncomfortable ride as well because the suspension is tuned differently, because you got so much more power in front of you bigger brakes and whatnot. So another reason is ride comfortability. And it's also for that person that wants the looks of a nice V8 muscle car, because the V6s generally look pretty much the same. There's a couple cues worth of difference between the V6 and the V8 models. I mean, and some of them look practically identical. So it's for that guy that doesn't need all the performance but still wants the looks. So when comparing an RS Camaro to an SS Camaro, you could hardly tell the difference between the two if it wasn't for the badging, because most of them come with the same wheels, I believe. You get the lighting package, of course. You get the xenon lights. You get the body trim around as well. There's a couple other things that you get. So if you were untrained and you didn't know cars, like to the untrained eye, an RS Camaro and an SS Camaro generally would look the same to you. So yet again, there's another reason why people would settle for the not settle, but choose the V6 over the V8. And finally, to my last reason why I think that people would pick a V6 car is gas mileage and maintainability, because V6s, as we know, they're a lot cheaper to maintain. You know, you're getting 30 on the highway with a V6, where you don't get that in a V8. Insurance is a lot more expensive for the V8 models, and also the maintenance costs, like the general dealer maintenance costs, oil changes, and stuff that goes along with that. You know, performance parts are more expensive as well. So that's generally another reason that people choose to buy the V6 over the V8. Now let's talk V6 performance a little bit. You know, we all know they're not quite as performance oriented as the V8s, but you know, I mean, even if you do have a V6 and have driven one, like the only V6 I've yet to drive is the Challenger V6. I've driven a Charger V6, I've driven a V6 or RS Camaro, and I've driven a V6 Mustang. And I have to say, they're pretty powerful cars. They're all quality cars as well. I'm a fan of American cars, and I think they do a great job with their cars. Needless to say, I don't have a stance for import against, you know, domestic cars. I like them all the same. But yeah, as far as performance goes, you know, it's always the argument that the V8 is always better and the V6 is always the poor man's car, but it really doesn't have anything to do with that, to be honest with you, because a V6 car nowadays, the amount of performance they pack into that type of car, it pretty much can beat a lot of cars on the road. You know, a lot of the common cars you see out on the road, they're no match for the V6 type muscle cars, you know? Also, another reason I just thought of that people buy V6 cars is also has to do with the price point type thing, which would be that, you know, some people prefer a nicer interior as far as things go. So like I was saying, like that high 20s for the V6 to low 30s, like you're talking like you can either go fully loaded V6 or you can go under or base model loaded V8 model. So if you're not a fan of having all the conventional stuff like the green screen radio and cloth interior and no sunroof and stuff like that, you know, if you're not a fan of any of that, then most people opt for the fully loaded V6 because you're sitting inside the car, as people don't get most of the time. So your butt is in chair and you want to be accommodated by everything around the car, because that's where you're spending all the time. You're not spending your time outside the car. I mean, I know a lot of people love to work on their cars and whatnot, but in order to drive the car, you're obviously inside it. So for that reason, many people opt for the fully loaded V6 models, where you're getting leather, heated seats, heated steering wheel, whatnot, and it makes a nice, more luxury type driving experience, while still maintaining the characteristics of a muscle car. Because on the outside, the fully loaded V6s still look, in my opinion, just as aggressive as a V8. Like I said, you can't really tell the difference too much if you had an untrained eye, unless you know cars. Then you could tell the badging is always a pretty big giveaway. But usually when I see a car go down the road, I'm not just scanning it for badges and then, you know, saying, oh no, it's just a V6, let me turn my head away, it's not worth me looking at, you know. I respect every car that's out there, you know, and I say, you know, kudos to you, that's a very nice Mustang, or kudos to you, that's a very nice Camaro or whatnot, you know. I'm not hunting for, you know, a badge or things I could say negative about the car. I take it for what it is, and you know, I'm very impressed with everything that's out there as far as, you know, the muscle car game goes. You know, I don't really think that there's a bad one out there as far as V6s go. I really don't think that there's anybody that's far behind as far as the competition goes. Like, I wouldn't say that, you know, any of the three major muscle cars as far as the Challenger / Charger, because the Charger is a 4-door. Some people don't really consider that a muscle car, but back in the day it was. Camaro and Mustang, as far as those go, it's pretty hard for me to say if there's anyone like totally losing this one, you know, the modern muscle car wars as far as it goes, you know. And one more point I just want to make as a side note, that the V6s actually generally outsell the V8s, mainly because they're affordable, and, you know, well, that's generally what it is. And the way the performance has been, it's just, they've made, by leaps and bounds, they've improved V6s over this decade. So, you know, I couldn't really say if there's anyone, you know, losing the modern muscle car wars. I could say, though, however, Dodge makes the least amount of sales out of the three companies. Obviously, Chevy's in the lead, but they don't have too much of an upper hand over Ford. So don't ever overlook a V6 and think, oh, it's not a muscle car because it's a V6. Well, you know, they're pretty popular, and they're popular enough to outsell V8s. So, and generally convertibles are popular in the V6 platform as well. So another reason why people buy the V6, and I would consider it, yeah, it could definitely be considered a muscle car as well, because the muscle car platform of a convertible can be a V6 as well. They've been making them since back in the day, and it's still a very popular option today. Another thing I want to add to this discussion is something that I'd say we could all agree upon, and that's when someone tells you, think about your dream muscle car, what would it be? Do we generally tend to think about, oh, the V6, I would love to have that, that is my absolute dream car? Or do we say we want the top of the line V8 performance car? And obviously it's the second choice, you know. And I could attest to this because I've never once dreamt about as a kid, like, oh yeah, I'd love to have, you know, the V6 model, you know, over the V8, you know. If money was no option, everybody would, you know, pick up a V8 for themselves, but that's not the case in today's world. And that's why I just want to add this to the discussion, saying that, you know, another reason we could, I don't want to say count out the V6, but why we wouldn't generally group them into the category of muscle cars is because when you think about a muscle car, it's in the title itself, muscle. Do you generally think when you envision a V6 car that it packs a whole bunch of muscle? Generally, people that don't really know cars would say they don't. They don't really qualify as muscle cars because they don't pack enough muscle. But people that have actually, you know, driven and that know the V6s of today would say, yeah, they do pack a pretty substantial amount of muscle, but not as much as a V8. Like, that's generally the argument here. And so let's get back on the topic of V6 cars and if they qualify as muscle cars. Some people make the argument that just based solely upon engine size and displacement that they don't qualify or don't count as a muscle car. And I can sort of see where they're coming from when you're talking about what a muscle car was defined as years ago. So the height of the muscle car wars was roughly around the late 60s to the 70s. The 70s was the major decade where the muscle car wars existed because the Ford Mustang came out in 1964 and a half. And it wasn't until 67 that the Camaro debuted their Mustang Fighter, which was their very first muscle car. And that's the era where in the late 60s, where the muscle cars, the Mustang was coming out with their fastback model, because in 64 and a half they debuted at the World Fair the convertible coupe Mustang. Back in that that time period, sounds like ages ago when I say the word time period, but back in that era, a muscle car was generally defined as stuffing the biggest engine you possibly could that would fit in your hood. Basically, we were talking ginormous size engines, well in excess of 400 cubic inches. Now, there are hardly any production cars, I'm talking hardly any production cars that come in sizes that great. You know, we're not, you know, you can't go to your Chevy dealership and order a Corvette now with a 454 motor in it. You used to be able to do that. As the modern era began for muscle cars, you know, they started lowering the displacement, mainly due to we had the oil crisis and whatnot, but we don't see engines with a displacement of that magnitude. So I can see where people are coming from when they say, oh yeah, it's only a 3.5 or 3.6 or 3.7 liter V6 under your hood. You know, there's so much space under there, it looks ridiculous to even be in there. You know, and then I could just throw the argument back at them and say, well, you know, try comparing that with the EcoBoost and then it won't look such a tiny engine, you know. You try to make that, you know, people try to make that argument, but yet, you know, Ford just made a 4-cylinder Mustang and it's selling like hotcakes. And to say that a V6 looks ridiculous under the hood, go pop the hood of a Mustang EcoBoost. I believe it's a 2.3 liter 4-cylinder. The amount of space that's under that hood is insane. The amount of space that's in excess where you could fit a greater engine, because again, it's on the same chassis as what the V8 Mustang would be. So the amount of space under that hood, you know, it's pretty laughable as well, but it still makes 300 horsepower and 320 pound-feet of torque. Again, nothing to sneeze at. That's, you know, not a slouch by any means. That's a pretty healthy amount of horsepower. And like I said, those things have been selling excellently. And, you know, so if you're not going to call a V6 a muscle car, then you certainly can't call that a muscle car. And if you're going to try to make the debate on engine size makes you qualify as a muscle car, I'd say you would be somewhat correct and somewhat wrong depending on what type of standards we're talking. Because if we're talking as far as modern muscle cars go, basically what's surrounding this topic and this sort of discussion, when you're talking modern muscle cars, the Camaro is the leader in displacement size, as they have a 6.2 liter for, I'm talking just, you know, SS model. I'm not talking anything greater than that, like as far as ZL1 or for Dodge, the SRT, you know, or the Shelbys for Ford. I'm just talking, you know, your I wouldn't call it standard, but your, I would say, middle of the road class V8. You're talking 6.2 liters, which is roughly right around like 370-ish cubic inches. So we're not even talking 400 cubic inches, and that's the greatest displacement that's available right now. So to those people that try to make that argument, I say, yes, you are somewhat correct, but when we're talking modern, you're incorrect, I would say, because a muscle car can qualify as a number of things. So to count out a V6 just based upon its displacement size, I think is a little bit ridiculous. And then you have guys going, well, you know, you can get the same size V6 in a Honda and make the same amount of horsepower, the same size V6 in a Maxima and make the same power. You know, you are correct. It's generally around 300 horsepower, but it's not set up for the dynamic type driving that a muscle car, a V6 muscle car would be set up for. I mean, you're talking, when you think of Hondas, you think of family sedans as far as the Accord goes, because that's the only car that the V6 engine is available in. So you're talking like family sedan, or you have the sporty coupe, but yet it's front wheel drive. Now I'm going to continue this discussion right after I get gas. Okay, so I've just come back from refueling this gas guzzler. Don't really mind too much about how much this thing drinks gas, being that the gas prices are falling a lot. People are just so quick to count out the V6. That's pretty much the problem with, you know, today's auto culture type world, is that, you know, it's always the argument of you wish you could afford the V8 and that's why you downgraded to a V6, or, you know, you didn't have the funds to afford it. It's a poor man's V8, you know. And I think that's a bunch of baloney. That's a bunch of, that's you know, that's a stupid argument in my opinion, to be honest with you, because I don't think the V6 is a compromise at all, really. you know, as far as budget goes, that's probably the only spot where I'd say it's a compromise. But other than that, you're really not getting like night and day when you compare the V6 to the V8. So, you know, you're not it's not very far behind is what I'm trying to say here, is that, you know, it's not like, you know, when you buy a V6, you know, it feels like a Honda Civic amount of power, you know, as compared to, you know, like a Ferrari amount of power, you know. It's not like that, you know, they're pretty close. Obviously the V8 would be ahead of the game as far as performance goes, but they're not very far behind each other. So to say it's a drastic compromise, I would say you're pretty much wrong in that regard. And before you chew my head off about that last comment, I just want to say that I was comparing a stock Honda Civic because I respect the fast ones that are out there. I'm talking like stock Honda Civic as compared to a stock Ferrari 458 Speciale, let's say. You know, it's not that type of night and day whatsoever at all. What I'm trying to say is that there's really not a huge amount of compromise as far as performance goes. That brings us to the conclusion of our discussion in this vlog. There's nothing really more I could say about V6 cars other than I am on both sides of the issue. I hope I brought up enough valid points to make you see both sides. Like I said, be proud of the car that you drive also. It's all about being happy with what you've got, you know. What they say is, if you walk away from your car without looking back, you bought the wrong car. So always remember that. So don't let anyone ever disparage you because you have a V6 car, because I know there's a ton of people out there that say, oh, you got the V6 and not the V8, that's weak, man. You know, ignore those people, you know. You bought what you enjoy, you know, and even if your budget doesn't fill it, V6 cars are great. You know, they're not, like I said, they've come a long way, and the amount of things you can do to a V6 platform is insane. And the aftermarket is loaded with tons of different options if you feel that your V6 doesn't have as much power as you would like, and because you were tight on cash or had the budget that fit the price of a V6 initially, and maybe a few years later you've saved up a ton and you're ready to make your car faster, like I said, the aftermarket is loaded with the amount of things you can do. So, you know, don't think that, you know, power stops as soon as you get it stock. You know, you can do a ton of things to the car. So that's why I say V6 cars do and don't count as muscle cars, I would say, when it's very subjective. And when you think about the different points I've made and the different perspectives you could look at it from, I would say I'd have to be on both sides of the fence for this one. That's not going to happen often when I have vlog type questions or discussion questions like that. I'm not usually on both sides of the issue. I usually pick a stance, but maybe some of you guys could help sway my opinion one way or another. Please comment, like, rate, subscribe, and take care.